The End of the Devony Trail. Written by KamaciteClover. Narrated by Dodge82 and Horror Stories with the Baron. The vehicle swayed side to side as its tires rolled over the uneven terrain before us. We hit another bump, and I was flung to my right, nearly slamming my head against the SUV's roll cage. From the driver's seat, Trent maintained a dumb smile as he caught my near mishap in the corner of his eye. I was not having it. We had woken up at 5 a.m. and had been traversing in a fashion that I would consider aimless for hours. Though we were moving at a snail's pace, the constant jostling made me feel ill. "How much more of this do I gotta withstand?" I said, while holding in what little breakfast I ate.
"Just a bit further. We've got to be getting close now,"
Trent said absent-mindedly. His eyes darted from the terrain towards a map to the right of him. It had been haphazardly taped to the interior of the windshield. Light peered through its thin paper. It was something you would find at a tourist kiosk or one of those guided off-road adventure tours. Someone had used a red marker to draw on it. The line initially followed one of the routes, only to veer off a quarter way in. Why couldn't we just have stayed on the trail? My words escaped through a sigh.
You kidding me? I've done that one 1,000,000 times. Beginner stuff. You know that.
He scoffed. "It beats no trail at all," I said, half joking.
We'll agree to disagree. Besides, this is a trail. Or it was.
He said, staring forward. Branches cracked underneath as the vehicle continued forward. I looked at the map, then back at him. His eyes caught mine, and he smiled. "Is this?" I began to ask.
It is.
He responded triumphantly before I had a chance to complete my question. The Devony Trail. There had been many variations of the story, so it was hard to consolidate a definitive version. All I knew was that it involved a pioneer, author Devony, who had become lost near the end of the Oregon Trail. He supposedly stumbled across something after being separated from his company and blazing a new trail. Whatever he found, he never arrived at Oregon City to tell anyone about it. There had been much speculation over the trail's location, but despite the story's popularity, there was no evidence to prove its existence. Trent had spent several nights talking about it, pondering what might be at the end. I never thought we would actually go looking for it. You can't be serious. "And that's the map?" I said, unimpressed, pointing at the wilting paper attached to the windshield.
"Hey, I've got a good source. He swears by it,"
he said defensively. "Another old drunk in a pub, I bet. You sure this isn't just some more bull crap?" I teased.
"It wasn't at a pub, for your information. I met him at a gas station,"
he responded playfully. "Oh, yes, a far more reputable source," I said, dripping with sarcasm.
I don't know. It felt real. His eyes didn't waver for a moment. He's seen it, I'm sure of it,
he said distantly. "Did he know what's at the end?" I crossed my arms.
That part I couldn't get out of him. He said I should see it for myself,
Trent replied. "Classic," I muttered. He shoved me and smiled. Bushes slid against the doors of the off-roader as we made our way deeper off the beaten path. A large compass pointing northwest sat in the cup holder within the center console. Leaves and insects bounced off the soft top of the SUV. A wall of dense woodland underbrush laid before us with no indication that it would let up. Undeterred by this, Trent drove the vehicle straight through it, I braced against the interior as it violently shook while traversing the unaccommodating terrain. We came upon an incline. I did not realize how steep it was until we were halfway up it, but the tires kept their traction, and we reached the peak without issue. I had been staring at the map, trying to make sense of the maddening scribbles on it when the vehicle stopped. When I turned to look at Trent, he was staring forward, awestruck.
"It's here,"
he managed to utter with glazed eyes. I peeled the map to the side in order to get a better look. Several paces ahead of us, there was a clearing. It was a dirt path, desperately trying to keep the vegetation surrounding it at bay. Trent pressed the gas and proceeded towards the trail. As we traversed the underbrush of the forest at a slow pace, Trent could hardly hold his excitement. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was wrong. Assuming that this was the trail, the fact that it hadn't been fully reclaimed by the forest after all this time perplexed me. It almost looked like it was maintained to a certain degree. The dirt was packed in, as if it had seen traffic recently, and little to no branches hung over into the trail. "Trent, stop the vehicle," I said coldly.
What?
Trent said, almost laughing. "I don't like this. Stop the vehicle," I said at an increased volume. Trent turned towards me. The SUV continued rolling forward. We were a few yards from the entrance.
"What's going on, Cass? It's a bit late to get cold feet,"
he said calmly. I was ready to shout in his face when I looked past him. On the left side of the vehicle, only a few paces away, a man stood behind a tree, staring at us. Before I could say a word, I felt us plunge downwards. I looked ahead just in time to see the forest floor in front of the path give way to a pit. We accelerated rapidly. Darkness consumed the vehicle. And then, nothing. I awoke to a dozen or so beady eyes looking upon me, with fascination through a metal cage. My vision was slightly blurred and my head pounded. My eyes focused to see children gazing at me, jaw agape with toothless grins. They couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Drool leaked from a little girl's mouth. Something was off about them, primarily their appearance. It wasn't their tattered clothing or lack of hygiene, rather something I couldn't put on paper. As my senses came to, I took in more of my surroundings. I was on my side, in a rusty cage nestled in mud. I sat up. I could hardly kneel inside it without my head hitting its roof. I looked to my left. Trent was crammed inside with me. A gash dripped blood from the side of his head. I grabbed his shoulders and began to shake him. "Trent, get up. You need to get up," I whispered to him, barely finding my voice against the panic. The children began to laugh. I tried to ignore them. They did not find my lack of a response discouraging. The laughter continued at an ever-increasing volume until they were nearly convulsing. I did not have to show it. They were overjoyed by my distress.
"All right, that's enough for now. Don't you have chores to do?"
A harsh, airy voice said. The children scampered away, leaving a pair of boots in the mud behind them. In those boots was something that I would almost consider a man, From a distance, perhaps I would not have thought twice about it. He had the right number of arms and legs, 2 eyes and ears, a nose and a mouth. Though, as I looked upon him, the word man did not seem adequate. He was quite tall, couldn't have been less than 7 foot in height. He was horrifically thin, and his arms seemed to stretch further than they should have. His face was long and narrow, with splotches of sickly colors decorating its pale surface. Worst of all were his eyes. Those small black orbs were like rocks of coal embedded into his face. He looked upon me with a sickening amusement, his lips curled up to show hook-like teeth protruding from blackened gums. He knelt down. I instinctively backed away, colliding with the edge of the cage.
Rise and shine, sweetheart,
he hissed through his teeth. His eyes caught mine darting towards Trent. He was still out.
Oh, don't mind him. He'll be up soon enough. Had to use a little more force than usual. He's got a lot of fight in him. Should be good for later,
he said enthusiastically. Fragments of what happened came to me. Trent and I at the bottom of the pit, hands pulling us from the vehicle, struggling to breathe. Then nothing. I looked around our environment. Basic wooden structures surrounded us. I could hear livestock in the distance. A few paces away from us was a pile of what seemed to be camping gear. It looked new, no more than a few months old. "What the hell do you want from us?" I said shakily.
Now, in due time. First, introductions. My name is Virgil, and you?
He placed one hand to himself as he spoke, then outstretched it towards me. I remained silent. He put both hands up and shrugged.
No matter, names are inconsequential. You will serve your purpose just fine.
He spoke as if his throat was coated in sandpaper. Virgil turned and walked off towards one of the wooden houses on the right. He swung the door open, and as he did so, for a brief moment, I caught several pale faces staring at me before the door shut behind him. I turned my attention back to the center of the camp. My throat tightened at what I saw. There was a colossal mouth of a cave, several yards directly ahead of us. The wooden structures and camp itself had been built around it. I felt as though it would suck us into its endless void at any moment. Trent began to cough. I crawled towards him and leaned over as his eyes fluttered and opened.
Cass, what happened? Where are we?
Trent said in a daze. Trent began to get up and winced. He brought a hand to the gash in his head and lowered it in front of his face, rubbing the dried blood in between his fingers. He looked towards me. "I don't know. We're being held captive," I said.
What? How?
He said, wincing as he felt his head wound. "There was a trap along the trail. We drove right into it," I responded. He crawled over on his knees towards a small gate at the left corner of the cage. He reached his right hand through one of the gaps and grasped a padlock that was keeping it shut. His left hand went into his pocket, then froze.
They went through my pockets,
he said coldly. I checked mine. They had given me the same treatment. He began ramming his shoulder against the door. The metal wiring rattled as Trent attempted to barge through the door. The padlock managed to just barely hold the door shut against his attempts to break free. "You're going to attract their attention," I half whispered.
Do you want to wait and see what they have planned for us?
He snapped back at me. What are we supposed to do if we escape? We're in the middle of nowhere. I responded, frustrated.
There's a pack with a satellite phone in the back of the SUV. If we find a way to get to it.
Trent was interrupted by the sound of mud being displaced by boots. Several boots. I looked up to see Virgil along with a horde of men, women, and children encroaching upon us from all angles. Though there was some variation in height, all of them towered over us. Even the children were abnormally tall for their perceived age. Along with this, they all shared a narrow, malnourished build and tiny, coal-like eyes that assaulted us with their gaze.
No need to rush, young blood. Your turn is coming up real soon,
Virgil said as he strolled towards us. He approached the cage and reached into a tattered shirt pocket, pulling out a small key. He knelt down and slid it into the padlock, unlocking it. Trent remained in place, in shock. Perhaps witnessing their ghastly appearance for the first time had shaken his courage. Virgil swung the cage open.
Come on now. Don't be shy,
he said, beckoning with his hand. Trent began to crawl out of the cage. I followed silently. As I reached the opening, Virgil put out a hand. I stopped. He closed the gate and slapped the padlock back on it. Seemingly forgetting himself, Trent shot a look of protest at Virgil. He returned a diseased smile.
One at a time, good sir,
Virgil said playfully.
You've already taken our stuff, just let us go,
Trent shouted, clenching his fists.
Oh, you're free to leave. You'll find the exit on the other side of that cave,
he responded innocently. Virgil raised his hand towards the stone wall that sat before us. The denizens of the camp formed a line on each side of it, creating an immense hallway of sickly flesh.
You're lying. This is insane,
Trent said, the terror beginning to take hold of him.
There's a way out somewhere in there. Then again, maybe I am lying. Tell you what, I'll give you a choice. You can go in the cave, take your chances, or we could cut you open and let the kids play with your insides. What'll it be, Chief?
Virgil said with a grin, clapping his hands. Trent slowly looked away and faced the cavern. His head darted back towards Virgil. His rage mostly covered the terror that hid underneath.
No. If I go in there, I'm not coming back out, am I? Do what you will, but I won't play your sick game, you inbred freak,
Trent said defiantly. A hunched man with a spine that wanted to escape the confines of his skin hobbled towards Trent from the crowd at a surprising speed. In an instant, a bulbous hook of a hand reached out and lifted Trent upwards by the throat. His legs fluttered, suspended in the air, as he gasped between the man's grip.
You lack manners. Didn't your mama ever tell you?
Virgil's lecture was cut off by a loud crack. The camp fell silent. Trent's head was tilted to the left, too far to the left. My mouth was dry. I shook. Time seemed to stand still. The lumbering man loosened his grip. Trent collapsed into the mud.
Look what you did, Clancy! Look what you did!
Virgil said to the deformed man through gritted teeth.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I got excited.
The man slurred and pleaded.
You know how he gets!
Virgil shouted.
We can still use him. He's warm.
Clancy stretched his repulsive limb towards Trent's body.
It's gotta be live, Clancy! Live!
Virgil seethed with rage. Clancy began to weep uncontrollably. Virgil closed his eyes and exhaled. He patted Clancy with his right hand.
I'm sorry, Papa. I just liked watching the little man's eyes bulge out.
Clancy said in between sobs.
There. Everything's alright. I'm sorry I raised my voice at you.
Virgil said in a consoling manner.
Oh no. I ruined everything.
Clancy wailed.
No. You didn't ruin anything. There's still another one. Tell you what, you go grab her, and I'll let you play with the pigs later.
The pigs?
Clancy screeched in excitement.
The pigs. Now go on, and be gentle this time.
Virgil leaned his head towards me as he said this. I stared in shock at the twisted family display, all while Trent's corpse remained at their feet. Virgil handed Clancy a key, and he hobbled towards me with a horrific, gaping smile. I backed away from the cage's entrance as he almost barreled into it. He fiddled with the lock until it came loose and whipped the door open. He giggled as his massive branch of an arm reached in and grabbed mine. My shoulder was just about dislocated as he pulled me out of the cage and through the mud. I did my best to stay on my feet and keep up in fear of my arm being completely ripped off. I felt the eyes of the entire camp observe me as I was dragged and thrown in front of Virgil. I fell into the mud only a few feet away from Trent's body. I stood up, trembling. Virgil waved his hand towards the cave.
Looks like it's your turn after all,
he said, with a rotten, toothy smile. You're sick. There isn't an exit, is there? The words slipped out of my mouth in reaction.
Perhaps. Either way, I ain't telling you.
Virgil could hardly hold in his laughter. What is wrong with you people? I screamed at him.
Nothing is wrong. We're special. We are all special. Some of us are more special than others. Do you understand?
His jovial attitude shifted into something colder as he spoke. I only stared back at him in silent horror.
You will,
he said, as his brow narrowed. I felt Clancy shove me forward. The denizens of the camp converged behind us, cutting off any possible path of escape. My sneakers sunk into the mud as I approached the mouth of the cave, as if the ground itself was trying to prevent me from taking another step towards whatever lay ahead of me. The crowd watched silently in anticipation. I stood at the edge of the entrance. I had no choice. They were going to butcher me if I stayed. I stifled a tear thinking about Trent. I couldn't break down now, or it would be over. I took a few deep breaths, then stepped into the cave. I nearly lost my footing at the entrance as it descended rapidly. I caught myself last second, only gashing my knee on a rock. I crouched down and slowly maneuvered the slope. The first section was a small chamber. Light cast from the entrance behind me, making it relatively easy to navigate. There was a strange rectangular slab sitting in the center of the chamber. In the cave wall directly opposite of the entrance, there was a gap. A large arrow pointing to it had been carved in the rock nearby. Approaching the gap, I looked inside. It was pitch black. I scanned the chamber once more. This was the only way forward. It was narrow, but I had enough room to traverse it if I went in sideways. Without giving myself any more time to reconsider, I entered the passage and began to edge through it. I just had enough room to move my neck. I stopped and looked back at the light of the previous chamber. Only a few paces in, and it felt like miles away. I turned my head back to my right, facing deeper into the corridor. I paused. If I were to wait long enough, perhaps I could sneak back out and make a run for it. I looked back towards the entrance, only to be met with Clancy's warped face staring in after me. He let out a deep chuckle as he heaved something across the cave floor. My only light source disappeared in an instant. I desperately made my way back towards the entrance. I placed my hand against it. Stone. Had he moved the slab by himself? How could someone have the strength to move such a thing? There was no going back. In the near absolute darkness, I could make out an incredibly faint light. Collecting myself, I continued. After traversing the unforgiving darkness in that cramped space, I reached the next chamber. Narrow slits of light came from small openings in the ceiling, revealing an expansive cavern. A large beam shone from the left corner. An opening. I rushed towards it, narrowly avoiding falling over unseen debris on the cave floor. I stood directly underneath the pool of light and looked upwards. My heart sank. The hole looked to be roughly 30 feet above me. I had no way of reaching it. The sun shone upon me as birds chirped. I wanted to scream. What were they getting out of this? I took a step back to try and get another look at the ceiling. Perhaps there was some kind of ledge I can climb onto. I heard a crack from below my feet. I looked down. It was bone. A human bone. Not just one, but many. The cave floor was covered in them. I scrambled away in a panic, but I tripped and fell into a pile. The bones clattered as I displaced them. A deep moan echoed off of the cave walls. My eyes scanned for a place to hide. Several columns stood dispersed amongst the cavern. I threw myself behind the nearest one and waited. It was not long until I heard it. The rhythmic thumping of flesh colliding with the ground. It started off slowly, but rapidly increased in speed until it seemed to be a sprint. Then it stopped. I heard it sift through the remains. It let out another moan. It was like 3 voices in different octaves were wrenching in pain. I knew I shouldn't look. But I found myself slowly leaning around the pillar to peer at the source of the noise. Looking past the column, my eyes fixated on it. It had to be at least 10 feet tall. Its spine curved forward grotesquely. Its skeletal structure was visible, pushing through its pale, veiny skin. Its arms hung by its side, almost touching the floor. Its hands were split down the middle into 2 different segments, with talon-like digits protruding from them. I held my breath. Its attention was focused on the pile in front of it. Without warning, its head turned, looking directly at me. Its eyes were cold, dark pearls. Its face was split vertically into 2 sections, teeth protruding from each side, forming a mouth. The face pulled apart as it let out a blood-curdling moan. I leapt from the column and began recklessly sprinting to the right of the corridor. I heard it bound after me. I likely had less than a few moments before it caught me. Under the illumination of the few gaps in the ceiling, my gaze swept the cavern looking for a way to escape. Ahead, the cave seemed to turn. To my right, I spotted a small gap. I flung myself into it. An arm came in after me. It dug into my left hip with its rending claws. I let out a scream and pulled away, deeper into the crevice. Its grisly appendage swung furious at me. It howled in a rage. I looked to my right. The cramped opening continued into another chamber, only a few paces ahead. I pushed onwards, clutching my side as it burned with pain. As I made it out of the gap, the creature retreated its arm. Rapid footsteps followed. I wouldn't have a lot of time until it caught up with me again. I looked to my right. It was a dead end. I heard it sprinting from the left part of the chamber. My heart hammered as I searched for another exit. I took a step forward. Water soaked my sneaker. At the bottom of the wall directly in front of me was a shallow pool coming from a small opening. Could I fit through it? The creature cried out. It was in the chamber. I had no more time to think. I dove onto my chest and began to crawl inside. I felt it reach in after me and slice my left thigh. I gritted my teeth in pain and pushed forward until I was out of reach. I let out a horrific cry, its claws scraping against the rock as I laid there in anguish. After a few moments of silence, I heard it dart off. I laid still in the cramped space. If I had hesitated a second longer, it would have had me. I worked up what courage I had left and continued forward. The opening quickly began to shrink around me. The squeeze was too tight to maneuver my head. I would have to keep it to one side. I tilted it to my left. I inched forward by using my hands, feet, and hips. A thick layer of water soaked my clothes and sat just below my mouth. My right cheek dragged against the ceiling. Thoughts of getting wedged or encountering a dead end entered my mind. I forced them away. I could not think of getting stuck, not now. The water seemed to climb slightly higher with every bit of progress. I was about to give in to despair when I caught the opening of another chamber on the edge of my vision. I inched forward. It was illuminated by the glow of lantern sitting on the floor by an entranceway. Through it, I could see trees swaying. I couldn't believe it. Before I could maneuver out of the squeeze, a pair of boots stepped into the doorway.
Virgil's been looking for you,
A scraggly voice shouted. I shivered. From the left of the room, 2 other pairs of boots appeared.
What is it? We were visiting Mama.
A voice wheezed.
We caught another one. He's injured. Not suitable prey. Virgil wants you to drop him in the hole.
The voice in the doorway responded. There was a grunt as the man stepped to the side and the 2 pairs of boots marched out of the chamber. The man standing in the exit followed them out the door. I laid still for several moments, catching my breath. I managed to calm my nerves and pulled myself out of the squeeze. The chamber was smaller than the previous sections of the cave. It was not much bigger than a typical bedroom. A sharp pain shot through me as I tried to stand up. I caught myself against the cave wall. It's when I noticed something. There were drawings on it. They were comprised of crudely drawn stick figures and covered the walls and ceiling. One depicted a man in what seemed to be a wagon. It sat in front of a fork in the road. Another one had it surrounded by animals. I couldn't make out the details on some of them as they were too vague, but one stuck out. It was the man, and he was standing in front of another figure. One that was well over 3 times his size. Its body was misshapen and something seemed to be coming out of its head. The next image was these 2 figures surrounded by dozens of other figures. What the hell was all of this? Directly opposite of the entrance was the opening to another chamber. I wanted to leave right then and there, but curiosity already had its hold on me. Lantern light flickered from within. I found myself slowly approaching it. I traversed a narrow corridor until I stood inside the neighboring room. I stared upon it, unable to move. It towered over me. Sitting in the center of the chamber on a throne crafted of rotting wood sat an unspeakable desecration of nature. Veins ran up its claw-like appendages resembling winding cables. Its pale skin was weathered and mummified. Its hands were comprised of 3 talon-like digits. Its head was split into 2 sections with a cavernous maw sitting in between them. Root-like tendrils of flesh rose from its scalp. 2 dark orbs sat on its face, but they were hollow. Whatever life had once occupied it had since vanished, yet its body remained. I sprinted back through the corridor and out the exit, ignoring the pain from my wounds. I would get the phone from the car. It had to still be in there. I heard someone whistle behind me. I turned to see Virgil smiling, a few paces away from where I had just escaped. In his hand was the satellite phone.
You looking for this, sweetheart?
He said, laughing. It was over. There was nothing more I could do. Then he tossed it in front of me. I was stunned. He smiled as I looked at him, and then the phone.
Everyone else wanted to seal that little crawl space, but it always makes things a little more fun. I was hoping someone would make it through, eventually.
He said through a smirk. I only stared back at him.
Go on. Take it and run. Call for help. It will just send more our way. I was tempted to do it myself, but something tells me it will sound better coming from you. Then, after you've had your fun wandering in the woods, we'll come and find you,
he said casually. I slowly picked up the phone, refusing to take my eyes off him. He smiled. I darted in the opposite direction. As I ran, I heard him laughing.
See you soon,
he shouted after me while cackling. I've been searching for hours, but I cannot retrace the path we took to get here. I've managed to evade them for now, but I know it's just a matter of time until they close in. On some occasions, I could have sworn I heard that low moan. But that can't be right. I left that thing in the cave. Whoever receives this message, don't go in search of the Devony trail, for at the end of it, his family waits.